My name's Mike Pittaro. My career kind of rotates around the intersection of data warehousing, cloud computing, big data. I've been doing this stuff for about 15 years. Most recently getting pretty heavily involved in both OpenStack as a developer and consulting business and a lot of DevOps work and all things in the cloud. The purpose of this panel was to try and open up an interesting debate on the issues related to open cloud and APIs specifically. We've had a lot of talk in the past about APIs, whether they're important, whether they're not important. And if you were listening this morning, there are some recurring themes here. We keep hearing about, we hear about distributed systems, we hear about lock-in, we hear about data gravity, we hear about portability, and all of those things kind of intersect around the APIs. To anybody that knows me, I'm extremely opinionated, but my job on this particular panel, my intent is to be a moderator. So rather than driving the conversation with my own particular opinions, if I do that, somebody's going to reach out, like Geoff here can reach out and slap me. My job is to let the panelists talk.
Hey, real quick, sorry to interrupt, but there should be a microphone somewhere.
Can everybody hear me, or do I need to get a microphone?
No, it's too, you can't hand back.
Well, then all of us need to be mic'd, or there must be a mic. I am, exactly.
I didn't realize we
Absolutely.
had a mic. Is this guy on now?
You guys won't need coffee after you
I
hear
want
this.
his mic.
I don't know how many mics are here. Other than me, I'm a mic, but what other mics are here? Dave's making a decision. They wanted to do the panel standing up.
You all want to stand for hours?
An hour?
It's an agile panel.
Okay, that's cool. That's cool. Yeah, well, there's two chairs there if you want them, I guess.
We did. Stick a chance.
Am I okay with this mic now?
No.
No? Okay, well, I'll speak up. I don't mind, but I'm hoping everybody can.
Hold on one second.
Okay. I'm sure you can. I don't know if it was the right one. I just turned it on. Maybe we just need to turn it on.
The AV guys.
Yeah, 1 and 2.
Hold on one second. Let me just
Hello?
when you're starting. I need it. Thanks.
Oh, okay, okay. No, it's
It's all
fine.
carefully coordinated.
Carefully coordinated.
There's the second line by the chance.
There's a lav mic in there. There's not a second.
There's a lav mic. I could try the lav mic and use the.
No, no, it's working. If you speak into it.
It's working.
Which one was the lav? Is this B?
Yes. You can use that as well.
No, this one is working.
Okay, we'll just pass this along. This is reasonably good. I think everybody can hear me now. They can hear the chatter in the back. So do we want to reset as people are coming in here?
Yeah.
Let's see, how many more people left out there?
How much food's left?
I think the food's gone. Food's gone. This is a tech conference. The food never lasts. Okay, so as people are... I think we can get started. I don't know how many more people are going to come in here. So since I have a microphone, can everybody hear me now? Okay, about this distance, guys, because we're going to be passing it around. I'm not a microphone expert.
Yeah.
My name's Mike Pittaro, and I'm going to be moderating this panel discussion on APIs. For those of you that have been at the conference this morning and even through yesterday, we've had a lot of talk in the open cloud space around portability, migration, openness, lock-in on the part of vendors, evolution, adapted distributed systems came up this morning, another interesting aspect. And a common theme among all those kind of meta themes in cloud is APIs become, I think, important because you talk to these systems through some sort of interface. So all your interaction with these systems is through some published interface, the API or the contract. I have strong opinions on APIs and openness and so on, but I'm going to moderate the panel, and what we've assembled here is, I think, kind of a world-class team of people that have also strong opinions on APIs and also work with them quite a bit. So going down the list here, this is Anant Jhingram. He works for Apigee essentially on data. Prior to Apigee, he was at IBM. He was vice president and CTO of IBM's data management division. He's also an IBM fellow and has done a lot of work in cloud computing for IBM. So somebody that works primarily with data and currently primarily with APIs. I have Geoff Arnold here, who has a long and storied career in the world of the computer industry. He originally worked on something called PCNFS, for those of you that have been around a while and remember NFS going to the PCs, which was probably one of the first standardized APIs for RPC work. And after that, he worked at Yahoo, and you also worked
Amazon, Huawei.
Amazon, and a number of other companies. So again, cloud computing, but always on that engineering side of dealing with people using the systems. David Lutterkort is from Red Hat. He's working on 2 projects right now. He's working on Delta Cloud, which is one of the cloud portability. What I call it portability would be the correct
Cross-cloud API.
Cross-cloud APIs. He also is Red Hat's representative on the Distributed Management Task Force, the DMTF, and he's worked on the CME standard. So he has some opinions about cloud portability, as you can imagine. Next up here is Adrian Cole. Adrian works for CloudSoft. He's the originator of the JClouds library, which is another cloud portability library. And then finally down here in the end, I actually have a cloud guy, cloud infrastructure guy. So we have Chris Chen here from Will, I'm sorry, I had it Chris here, but Will Chen, who works at Citrix on CloudStack. So everybody here, I think, has some experience, and the reason I put the panel together this way is to have some different perspectives. I didn't just want people working on OpenStack or on Eucalyptus. I wanted people that are actually on the outer edges of that ecosystem rather than the guts for their opinions. Now, in terms of questions, I'm going to kick things off. Because as we know, we've had a lot of debate around this, and really the first question for everybody in the panel is, do the APIs matter? Or is it just more important that we expose functionality independent of the APIs, and how does that relationship work? So I'm going to put Anant here first because he's closest.
Absolutely. Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Yes, I think APIs very much matter. What I've talked about is the kind of the yin and the yang of cloud and APIs, that APIs actually need cloud and cloud needs API. And for the purpose, let me just take 2 seconds and explain 2 minutes and explain 2 hours and explain, no, sorry, literally 1 minute and explain. So APIs need cloud because in general, you have no idea what the spikes in your demand would be. And unlike enterprise applications, you really have to make sure that your APIs are delivered in an elastic cloud infrastructure. Now, the reason why cloud needs APIs is something very different than some of the things that you might hear from others. I'm not going to talk so much at the infrastructure as service level, because at an infrastructure as service level, there are other experts here. But we have worked with companies that have put out SaaS services in the cloud, and what they felt is that the portals that they put out for people to play with are for people. And as they grow up, they realize that enterprises are demanding that they should be able to interact with the SaaS provided services through programmatic models. And therefore, they have started to, for example, a customer like Innotus has said, okay, we have to API our SaaS delivered service so that people who are running it within the enterprise are able to connect and get a view of that deployment through applications that they built in-house. So in effect, what we are seeing definitely at SaaS, at PaaS and SaaS level, that cloud and cloud delivered services need APIs.
Good afternoon. So APIs is important. Of course, they're important because that's the way you write to a service. Simple as that. And this cloud we keep on talking about cloud, but all of the acronyms all end with that as a service, and it's a service interface, which is important. And by the way, I don't want to hear anyone saying RESTful anywhere during this session here, because that adds no value at all. The point is, it's about as a service. And I think as we go through this panel, we're going to hear plenty of counterexamples of where failure to pay attention to the APIs in services has led to failures which are very instructive.
Just taken away everything that I was going to talk about. Can't use the word restful with him now. Okay, now.
Okay,
That's why I put Geoff on the panel here, man. I want a contrarian. I need a good contrarian.
Just to pile on to that love fest over there, I think there's 2 big reasons why we need APIs. One is that cloud is about automation. There's the config management tools like Puppet and Chef are really coming into their own because of cloud, because of the need of automating things. And you can't have automation without APIs. There's no way. There's no point in even talking about that. The other one is we're all sitting here thinking at the in the back of our minds, well, in the infrastructure as a service space, there's one dominant player, and sooner or later we'll all be customers of Amazon. Kind of like everybody was going to be an AOL or CompuServe customer in the early 90s for internet access. And things in the internet access space hasn't really played out that way. And a big part of that is open standards, open source, and that needs to be driven through APIs. That's the level where you can get all the vendors to rally together. And generally, the big vendors rally together in standards meetings, but it's really the small players that benefit from that. Because nobody can afford to accommodate hundreds of APIs, but we want to have hundreds, thousands of cloud providers that live in each in their niche.
Red Hat is a big vendor or small?
We're a tiny. I'm surprised you
So, Adrian, you're a cloud portability, cloud abstraction guy. Where do you stand?
Well, I'm wondering if we'll have anybody who says API doesn't matter here. But,
I figured we'd start with an interesting
yeah,
question.
fair enough. So APIs are where you can start to measure services that are similar. And it's also a place where you can differentiate from other services. And I think that in the as-a-service space, a lot of players, even using the same products, can differentiate on services as exposed by extensions to APIs. And so I think that the discussion is definitely from clients that we work with and open source partners we work with is dual-faceted. One is which APIs do you care about and or support, and then when you're actually implementing a service, how can you live in that ecosystem, and are you constrained by it, or can you actually differentiate through it? And all of that basically assumes that you have to have an API, or else you can't even have these discussions.
Since I'm the fifth guy here, I'm not sure what more I could say about this. I mean, I totally agree. API, it's important, especially working with Adrian here, JClouds here. I know from the beginning, as we're moving through iterations of the CloudStack product, our API have changed significantly from one version. We've tried to stop that now, but I think what's more important is not about. I don't know if we're ready to be at one global, standard open cloud API. I'm not sure we're quite there yet. I think CloudStack's philosophy will be willing to adapt to what is the most important out there, because right now, you have a lot of ecosystem and a lot of areas out there that are building against these API. I think what's more important is to make sure that compatibility, just basically versioning and upgrading, making sure they're compatible with the previous versions. Actually, I mean, it's from my experience, probably from Adrian's experience as well. That's very important because each iteration comes out, and it's a significant effort to continue to try to ensure that it works from one version to another. But yeah, I mean, I can't disagree that API is not important. It's definitely something that certainly for all of us that we can allow the community and for you guys to develop against and use the product.
Can I just get 1 minute of rebuttal?
So,
No. But I think that there has been a conflation of APIs and standards and openness and everything else. And I think that APIs matter almost independent of standards and openness. Right? The example that I gave was Innotus wanting to participate in automation that can happen from within the enterprise. So I think that the API movement will take off almost independent of whether your success of your openness and standards takes off or doesn't take off.
So I was going to follow up because the reason I asked such a basic question is you still always get varying opinions, and I think two things really stood out from that first round of questions, and I think one was, as Anant said, the interest of organizations building internal apps that are adding APIs. In the enterprise world, most internal applications never had an API. There was an application with some sort of screen or maybe a web interface, and if you wanted to do any integration or access to the application, it was through the database. Everything was done backdoor. This is a big shift in the enterprise. I think that's one interesting takeaway. And I would agree with everybody. You need the you do need the APIs to be able to kind of remotely control the cloud, so to speak. And I think the other takeaway is Jeff's point here that, I don't want to hear anybody talk about REST, so obviously, what do you think I'm going to ask the next question about? But actually, the next question isn't about REST versus RPC. The next question is really, in the big scheme of things, what I want to ask is, because I think that's a good point, do we have too much focus on the representation and the syntax and the mechanics of the APIs, and not enough discussion on what the API should mean, both for cloud and in general? Which I think you touched on already, Anant. You just jumped ahead there.
So, I've been to the last 3 OpenStack meetings, and one of the things that was very interesting attending the OpenStack conferences was watching people trying to justify the creation of a different API for differentiation. And they had all sorts of great reasons why it was a good thing. We're RESTful, and Amazon isn't. Amazon is non-standards compliant thing. It's really not very good. And we can add all these cool features. And the question is, are we? And lots and lots of emphasis on new representation. Let's use JSON and so on and so forth. The concern here is that all that's going to disguise a tendency for semantic divergence here. That's what's really going to kill cloud APIs. Not can I convert an Amazon call into an OpenStack call, or can I create a Java wrapper which will wrap either of those 2 calls. What's going to kill it is that one cloud says a volume snapshot behaves this way, another cloud says a volume snapshot behaves a different way, and there's no way to reconcile those 2 things. So I'm much more interested in APIs as providing contracts for semantics than I am about APIs providing cool representations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would pretty sharply disagree with that. Simply because I believe that the notation and the syntax you use influences the way you think about things. Each notation makes thinking about things, some things easier and other things harder. And I think trying to divorce, trying to get to an abstract semantic happy place that is independent of REST and so whatnot will get you nowhere. So I think we should just swallow the pill and live in a very restful world, because that's on vogue right now, and 5 years from now we're probably sick and tired of it and have found something else.
Yep.
But let's embrace it and move on, and not...
I have nothing against REST, right? But I get sick and tired of people saying, oh, we have a RESTful API. And they don't actually say any of the other interesting properties of their API, like what it's compatible with, how it scales, how secure it is always just about the representation. I think that does a disservice to our users.
So,
Sure, yeah.
Adrian, you're dealing with this. Your opinion on the differences in meaning in the various APIs.
So the purest of REST APIs will cause you the most pain coding.
Somebody write that down.
Well, I mean, it's measurably. So, for example, if you look at looking at semantic link references and walking through a model, and as if you would be going through a web browser, there's a lot more code. There's a lot more HTTP requests. There's a lot more. There's no atomicity there. You have to have a sequence of things before you can do anything. And so for that reason, I try to not use RESTful so much as, say, HTTP API versus a native API. Because, for example, in the enterprise, well, I understand what you meant. There are obviously folks have written language APIs that weren't promoted, via web services, or maybe we're using SOAP or something else like that, that end up still being used at some point. And for example, the cloud controllers themselves they have their own internal API contracts and all these things that they need to then bind out to these other places that are sometimes RESTful, sometimes not so RESTful. But to the point of being, semantically equivalent, that is a very hard goal to reach, and the only way to reach that is through reasonable levels of integration testing. And so, for example, in our project, that was the first thing that we decided to do, which was to sometimes vainly attempt to normalize the data models underneath to the point where, for example, instead of having to memorize your favorite Amazon ID, you could say Ubuntu 10.10 and then minimum ran this, this, and this, and then actually have a test to try and prove that. It is a very very difficult thing to do, and it's very because a lot of the data models for cloud APIs don't have enough information there to actually expose the properties of the things you're interacting with, and so I can totally feel the tension there. But I would certainly appreciate an attention to form and also an attention to semantic equivalences, because with neither you can't get anywhere. With either you can get a distance, but both times, if you're only doing one and not the other, you'll be very annoyed. And basically in software, especially open source software, you're trying to attract people to help you. You want to reduce the WTF count as much as possible. And if your API you're interacting with has a lot of WTFs, or the semantic model has nothing there, and that's also WTF, all these things detract people from wanting to participate in it. And I think that's, when we're talking about open stuff, we want those open systems and APIs and data models to have the least WTFs. So not just the poor enterprise dude with a 3-month contract to works on it, but also other folks that have an hour or 10 minutes even to work on it.
So I don't want to get into a debate whether I'm not going to pick one side or another. I can tell you from our personal experiences on what one or another. So for us, I think the most important thing for the API right now, even to us, whether it's RESTful, REST-like, or a HTTP API, is simply just the ease of use. I think as we've developed our API for cloud, it's growing bigger and bigger, just as more features are being developed. And it's the hardest thing is for someone to look at it and just have absolutely no clue of how to deal with writing their script or writing their product on top of it. And I think the most important thing is not whether it's SOAP or a REST. Just if you can just look at it and just understand what it's supposed to do, I think by far that's the most important thing to us.
Cool. Hang on to the mic, because I have another question for you. Citrix and CloudStack have been in the news a lot lately because they're probably the most compatible implementation of an API compared to EC2. There are a number of people doing it. Sure. I'm not saying they are, because technically I don't know, but the question I wanted to ask the whole panel is, is in the context of standards and APIs, is adoption more important than standardization? And you've talked a little about adoption. So
we believe so. We had CloudStack API forever, but it's not something where we're not trying to become the standard. CloudStack is not here to become an API standard. We're not pushing the community to say, look, this is the way it has to be. This is what everyone should write upon. I think one of the biggest reasons why we decided to be more compatible with EC is because let's be honest here. Amazon, it's 800 gorilla in the open cloud space, and everyone uses it. Everybody understands the semantics of Amazon EC2 API. And so when you're going to move from a public to private cloud or public to some other cloud, everybody's the first thing is that when I look at this API, what does it mean in terms of Amazon EC2 API? And a lot of it also is you have an entire ecosystem built on Amazon EC2 API, so it makes it easier to transition from one cloud to another. Now that said, personally, I've gone through customers or immediately the first question they said, especially private ones, they said, look, if you don't have EC2 compatible, we're not using the product. That's it. The conversation almost stops there. But as I've worked with these customers, I said, look, we are. I don't want to debate who's more EC2 compliant or anything. But once they get to use the product itself, understand the various other features that CloudStack can do, 99% have shifted and say, look, we had a script, we had something that worked on EC2 API, but we found that look, that's like maybe only 50% of CloudStack. And that's all you can do, right? It's a set of API. We did not define it. As you can't leverage all the other pieces that CloudStack applies. So once they go through and they realize, okay, there's another 50%. How do we interact with that? Well, you have to, at that time, you really just have to choose. You have to make a decision. What do you want to do? You want to keep your software compatible with that current piece of with the EC2, or do you want to extend it more and use whether it's CloudStack, OpenStack, any other API that's out there.
The EC2 thing is a very interesting one. I've actually even had folks who want to use the EC2 Java API in JClouds against OpenStack, even though we have a Nova one. And I'm like, okay, sure.
It supports both.
Yep, good. But there's another advantage that gives you when you have multiple views, and this is something we've had a recent discussion on, and that's that you really are thinking in views here. You have your own API for your product, whatever that happens to be, and then you have a view, maybe an EC2 view, and maybe another view for different APIs. And it gives a lot of flexibility to developers because, for example, they can do a makeshift EC2 portability thing and get started with your product faster while they do it sort of the right way, if that's right, and in a reasonably risk-free fashion. So, for example, our Nova stuff for Essex is still stuck in an alpha branch until we finish all the rest of the stuff. And in the meantime, people can use our eucalyptus adapter because that works with OpenStack. And so it gives us a lot of flexibility to have multiple views, and I'm not so concerned with what those views are. I wouldn't say that EC2 or any of the Amazon API models are ones that we should seek out to reproduce. Most folks who have worked at Amazon Web Services and no longer work there did something different as soon as they left. And a lot of folks have said that the data models there are directly because of some middleware system that they happen to already be using. And so these aren't really good things to use to justify API design. And so I wouldn't say that we should all just go after an EC2 style model. Particularly how this hits us in practice is first things you don't have are any sort of path for federation. There's nothing in the API that actually helps you with that. Secondly, most people are hijacking fields in their implementations for things that they shouldn't do, which is back to the semantic equivalence thing where you look to see if an availability zone is on and it has an IP address in it. And things like that. And so because the model doesn't work, people start hacking things, and that just makes for brittle applications. And so I would say go for models that you can work in, and it's nice to also have an EC2 thing.
Yeah, I think there's on the one hand we need to face up to the reality that EC2 is the 800-pound gorilla and has a huge part of the IaaS market right now. And so there's a lot of anxiety out there to migrate to some other solution that doesn't give me the nice EC2 safety layer. But as Will said, I think a lot of it is before the fact anxiety, and once you realize how little you depend on the actual EC2 API, that anxiety goes away. EC2 in particular, or all the AWS APIs in particular, are, I think, the most terrible candidate for a standard you could dream up. For one, there are huge legal question marks around it. I challenge any public cloud provider to stand up an EC2 compatible API layer and see what happens next. There are governance issues. There's no way for anybody to get anything into the EC2 API except for Amazon itself. I know of cases where people have had feature requests into the API open for years and don't get anywhere with it. Seemingly simple things. And lastly, on the technical level, it's a fine API for Amazon, but it's not a good API to work on multiple providers. There's no discoverability in the API. If you want to have if you want to offer EC2 compatibility, you have to really do everything. You have to offer stateless instances, EBS-backed instances, elastic IP addresses, all that stuff, because there's no way for clients to figure out that a certain aspect of the EC2 API is just not there in your implementation. So it puts a huge burden on anybody who considers that. And the only way we've gotten away with it so far is that everybody said it's EC2 because the way you launch instances looks pretty much like it does in Amazon, but once you get to the finer points, it just doesn't work.
So, disclaimer, I used to work for Amazon, I no longer work for Amazon. Some of the things that have been said about internals are true, and some of them are kind of funny. Look, Amazon did not create this as a standard. Amazon created this as a service initially initially a storage service and eventually a compute service to make some money, and eventually to migrate their e-commerce over to. If you want discovery, then that's clearly, you know, if you create an API for a service, then you're not interested in discovery, and nor do you expect them to be. So if you want to layer that on top, that's just fine. We can go ahead and do that kind of thing, and use that to discover the endpoints. If you want service description, so you can actually say what are the features implemented with the service, then let's go ahead and create that as a higher level service, which it sounds like daily like sort of UDDI for cloud. So let's go, fine, let's do that. That seems like a really poor reason to trash the Amazon API. The legal stuff is interesting, and I think we are actually. Anyone tracking the news today? Has the jury come back on Google Oracle? I mean, we are living right now in the middle of an interesting legal case which will affect this API issue, because one of the things that's being discussed in the Google Oracle lawsuit is the copyrightability of APIs. And so even though it doesn't directly address cloud, it's going to affect what we do in this area. So, you know, I think that it's very hard to argue with business success. I have reviewed dozens of RFPs all saying, I want an Amazon compatible cloud. And the question is, you know, given that reality out there and the fact that pretty much all of the users of private cloud services are going to also wind up using public clouds for good business reasons, the question is, how do we come up with a solution which respects all of those needs?
So I think that APIs almost have nothing to do with openness and compatibility. I think that's just plain wrong. I can't say it in any plainer words. APIs are all about adoption, as Will and Mike talked about. And proprietary systems can have completely open APIs. Proprietary systems can have complete open APIs so that more and more people build to it. APIs are about unlocking and absorbing the power of the development community. Now, it so happens that you can combine, but I think that saying that APIs equals openness equals compatibility is going in the wrong direction. APIs equals adoption and bringing more people to the ecosystem.
I think what you're describing is the first step, right? If you come from a world where nothing has an API, unlocking the functionality with an API is clearly a huge first step, and there's no openness implied by that. But there's a second step where once you have a huge amount of adoption and you're in a market, in a place that in an ecosystem that's important for the entire industry, where questions change, right? Where everybody's saying we have our own API. We've seen this story play out over and over again. So it's not part of the story saying initially APIs are not about openness. At some point they are.
Right. But what I feel is therefore maybe the infrastructure as a service discussion has moved to the second step. Yeah. Maybe it has, right? But if you think about cloud as having a PaaS layer and a SaaS layer, right? They've not necessarily migrated towards that step, right? When Innotus talks about its project management as a service, they're talking about today that you have got a portal, a website with which you can interact with project management. And they say, no, we have got to open it up so that other applications and other developers can interact with our backend systems, right? It's not about openness. They're not trying to make their stuff compatible with somebody else's project management service. So I think that you're on a very good point that infrastructure as service has probably moved to the second stage, whereas the PaaS and the SaaS layers, I feel, are still on the first stage.
So I'm going to recap here because I heard a couple of interesting things. We talked a little bit I asked about adoption, and the first thing I heard through all the answers, if everybody else is following with me, the first thing I heard through all the answers is the Amazon API has a lot of adoption, which kind of makes it a de facto standard. I'm going to put standard in quotes because it's not standardized. The second thing I heard is Amazon's not an open API because Amazon control it. I don't think anybody would disagree with me there. Amazon totally control it. There might be legal issues. But the other thing I heard through that conversation is I asked about adoption, and everybody talked about EC2, which is elastic compute. So I think the next question, I'm going to start with Anant because they do more work in enterprise APIs, but going beyond the compute API, what other APIs should we be thinking about, or what other functionality? Because I think we're going to the theme where functionality and APIs are tied together. We expose functionality, APIs is the way we do it. What other functionality do we need to be thinking about? We have databases, we have storage, we have the platform APIs, but everybody answered the question in the context of compute. So I'm going to hand it to Anant and say, what are other areas do you think we can make progress in here?
I guess I don't make my point clearly enough. I said that in the platform in SaaS layer, right? The Innotus example was really about project management delivered as a service, right? And nothing to do with computation and everything else. But I think that whatever is the service endpoint at which you want to attract the developers, right? That is the one that needs APIs too. Now, I think that database as a service, Benioff can try, he has enough money to throw at it. And database as a service, by the way, within the enterprise is a slightly different story than naked database on the outside. But data as a service, right? Data as a service is a very different story than database as a service. So I'll just spend a couple of minutes on it, right? What this is about is not that there is a generic S3 SQL, MySQL, Postgres server available where you can dump stuff and get some. Yeah, sure, okay. But I mean, we all know that computation and data have to be together. So who would want to just get naked database as a service delivered to you? Again, Benioff can throw as much money as he wants at the problem, right? But data as a service says that I, as somebody, I'm sitting on top of data, and I want apps to be built that leverage that data. And if apps are built that leverage that data, then through some mechanism, freemium model or whatever it is, I will get paid for it. So I think that part is absolutely going to take off. I think the big data community has gotten it wrong. I've talked about it in that they're focused on the technology. It really is about the data. And then you start to think about, okay, will the semantic web, linked data, RDF-like techniques take off, or will more kind of pragmatic, the opposite of waking up a word, right? Will those kinds of things take off? I didn't use that word, right? Will that take off? I think that whether OData will take off, I actually went to Microsoft and I kind of pissed half of them off by saying that OData is a step in the right direction, but as long as it feels Microsofty, it's not going to go anywhere, right? So I think that this, in my mind, is going to be an absolutely explosive space with respect to delivery of data through pragmatic APIs.
So it's interesting that the first attempt to deliver a computing service as a utility, or the first major one, was the Sun Cloud or Sun Compute as a Service. They went off led with compute, forgot the storage, complete failure. Amazon led with storage, then went to compute, great success. I think so. Clearly, storage API, storage is so sticky. Storage is so compelling that storage APIs are clearly, in many respects, more important than the EC2 API. We pick on EC2 because we used to talk about virtual machines and crap like that.
Good stuff.
And then there's a bunch of layered storage services and other services, orchestration services, where anything where you know that the provider can optimize the behavior across the span of the infrastructure. So if I want to do orchestrated deployment, I could script it outside, or I could hand a script to the provider and say, you optimize this inside. In general, today we're doing it outside mostly. People like RightScale and others doing it outside, but we know that they could do it. The cloud provider could do a better job of placement of resources. So, in general, that's an area where it's going to be important. One of the biggest gaps, one of the areas that nobody's been talking about recently, is that, and it doesn't really apply to public cloud. Amazon's got their own operational models behind the scenes. One of the biggest gaps for private cloud deployment is the set of APIs that allow that private cloud to be integrated with the rest of the enterprise. The key distribution, the identity management, the logging, all the other infrastructure, the lifecycle management of the resources, all of that stuff is very complex, trying to deploy private cloud into a large enterprise is a difficult task. We need to get better standardization, or at least best practices of interfaces between the rest of the enterprise and that cloud. That's an area which is really ripe for innovation.
Yeah, and, yeah. From not necessarily disagreeing with anybody, but one thing that I'm seeing that I think is very interesting is, on the one hand, you have PaaS where all you get is some standardized app container, J2EE, whatever languages you're working on. And on the other side, you see infrastructure as a service growing towards PaaS, where you have to do more, but you get more freedom. And I think somewhere in there, there's still a gap today between those two, but we'll see those two grow together much more than they are today. And ultimately, I think we'll wind up at some weird hybrid between PaaS and IaaS.
Definitely tenant management, the admin stuff as well, admin orchestration, feedback, metrics, policy. There's things come up fairly often, especially considering in JClouds we have a lot of folks that are interested in federated stuff. And then from sort of the array of APIs that one needs when creating platforms, like what David was saying, it's growing, and there's lots of creepy crawlies, because you have, for example, Nova has a dozen plus extensions defined in core, and then some that are evolving outside of it. Some of them are just like more data on this extension. So when we start getting closer and closer to where a PaaS could itself be very portable, because most PaaSes, if you look at them under the covers, hardly any of them are actually working on more than a couple clouds at most. Probably part of the reason for that is that the infrastructure models, even though we continue to talk about those, aren't quite good enough yet to allow true portability there.
I think my colleagues have pretty much touched upon most of the but I think one thing, I agree, PaaS and SaaS, I think that's where it's going. The infrastructure level, it's, to me, I kind of agree, it's actually definitely moving up, but it's also being commoditized. There's almost nothing else you could do in the compute space. But one thing, other than the data and storage, I think one of the things that we've seen as well that could see improvements is networking. Things, APIs related to networking. I know EC2 has its flat network model that it imposes on everyone, especially if you want to be part of the EC2 ecosystem. You have to understand the security group. But it's something that enterprises definitely have embraced some. But there are also a lot of companies out there that have an existing infrastructure that's very hard to, as I said, it's very hard to bring in cloud into an existing infrastructure itself. It's difficult. You have customers that just says, nope, this is the way our IT is managed on network. You just can't change it. This is the way it is. And so, giving up more opportunities to, or expose more of these functionalities to manipulate more of the network level could, I could see that helping in the future as well.
So did you want to add something? No. So going through that round, I think we're kind of 50-50 here between whether the API is more important or the meaning of the data behind the API, which is something I thought we'd come to in this debate. As we go through this, Anant's pretty strong about the data, and personally that's the ballpark I've always filled in, exposing data versus exposing a particular API. I was going to go back to the standards end of things for a moment, because we did want to talk about open, and what I'm trying to understand, and personally I'm still confused, so I'm going to ask the experts here, where does open tie into this whole API/functionality exposure? What's open, what's not open? What do we need to do to try and drive that in the marketplace?
I've commented on it like 5 times. If you guys don't know my point of view, then there's nothing.
There, but I heard your point of view.
I yield 1 minute to the gentleman.
No, I think you made your position on open very, very clear, Anant. That's why I wanted to ask here.
Look, years and years ago, during the Unix wars of the late 80s and early 90s, there was this mantra which went sort of open interfaces and then compete on the implementation. And that's really what the API thing is all about. Get agreement on the APIs and then compete like hell with the implementation. And by the way, we're not commoditizing anything under the covers there. the existence of an agreed upon set of abstractions lets the infrastructure engineers go to town because they know that all they have to do is implement the abstraction. They don't have to expose it all in the sort of VMware style way where you have to be completely open kimono. So you're going to see some amazing things, networking particularly, in the infrastructure area over the next few years. So openness. The other thing is, whose interest are we trying to serve here? Are we trying to serve the interest of the vendor community or the user community? And the users fundamentally are going to look for things which give them economic advantage. Vendors, not always. Well, they're not always going to choose things which is best for the user. And so I want to make sure that the openness actually is serving the economic interests of the customers.
Well, David, what are your customers asking for? Because you're on the standards organization.
Yeah.
You know what people are asking for, so you have a perspective.
Yeah. I mean, for CME in particular, the people who are screaming the loudest about we need to have a standard are government organizations, especially European telecoms, who are saying we need to put something into tenders, and there is no suitable standard right now that we can put in there. And that is an important motivation to have a formal standard, and I think also one that will just drive adoption of the standard. In my mind, I think there's kind of two ways you can come at openness. One is from the customer view, and customers generally are worrying about openness way too late in the game, way after the market is set and they're locked in. So we generally encourage them to think about lock-in and openness much earlier. But it's hard because generally this happens around new technology, exciting like cloud, and there's so many other things you need to figure out first that openness kind of falls by the wayside. The other way to look at it is, especially with cloud, I think Randy Bias this morning had a really great quote about how, paraphrase, how cloud helps you drive out the things that aren't really business critical, that aren't really your competitive advantage. And we've seen a lot of that in the open source world, where, for example, a few years ago we started this messaging standard based on a few investment banks that came to us and said, hey, we need messaging like crazy, we need super fast, super reliable messaging, but it's having a messaging solution like that has no business value for us. The business value is somewhere else in all the applications that sit on top of that. And so we, together with them, we open sourced one of the implementations, built a standard around it, and all that. And I think that is a model that cloud drives even farther, that where you see much more common functionality that's not business critical being put into open source projects. And I mean, that's great for openness, to have more things in open source. I think that, to me, that's kind of the ultimate in openness. And open standards, I think, the next best compromise if you can't get there.
So I guess openness and agreement are two things that work best hand in hand. And so I mean, I've been tracking a lot of standards, and some of them are easier for folks to embrace, and it's hard because we want to have to not always define what open means all the time. But when it comes down to implementers, there's a few things. One, if there's an open spec or open standard by which you're working on, even if it's an openly accepted versus a actual open community like EC2, which is widely accepted but not open, is that they can develop products and feel secure while they're developing those folks that feel like they need to develop in the private, and have a chance that when this is delivered, it will actually be implementing something that's relevant to people. And so I think that from a customer-driven perspective, we get a lot of folks who spend inordinate amounts of time deciding, like OpenStack versus EC2, what's their clone thing going to do, or both, or three things, like their own native and everything else. And the lack of a open and accepted answer in infrastructure, where I think that adds a lot of thrashing, and that doesn't necessarily diminish value, but it does slow down progress. And so I think that open communities that people also accept is something we should seek out, or continue to seek out. And if that community doesn't exist, continue trying to build it.
I think our stance on standards is if the open source, if there is a standard or some sort of agreed upon API that the community or everybody else believes that's the right thing, I mean, that's something we'll embrace. It's not, again, we're not here to define a set of standards. We're all about adoption. You know, we listen to our customers, we listen to the open source community. If they believe that, you know, these set of APIs is what, you know, is what everyone believes is, that's fine. You know, we're not going to go and combat against it or say this is the wrong thing to do. It's not about us. It's really about people trying to, you know, using a relatively new technology here. It's growing. I mean, in the 3 years that I've done this, it's from the first day I started to 3 years now. I mean, it's vastly changing. And you know, I think it will get there. At some point, we will probably get to a standard, or you know, a common standard where everybody will start launching virtual machine, getting this. These may be eventually standardized. But you know, right now, we're at a pace that's growing. It's so fast right now. Features are coming every day. Every customers I've talked to, they always have something different, and it's very hard right now. And so it's not an easy answer to say. So as I said, for us, we'll embrace anything. If it's something that the community has agreed upon, this is something that, you know, is the right thing to do, we'll go for it.
So I think pretty much I heard adoption first, standardization later. Would that be? Adoption first and standardization will happen.
I think that'll just happen. That'll just happen.
But people are also asking for standardization up front, so that's everybody in it.
One thing that can happen actually is adoption can actually lead to standards from other forces. For example, Amazon has a huge U.S. federal government business. They've got a huge team out in Virginia that does nothing but support the federal customers for the standard Amazon. And so at some point, that there's going to be a pressure to create a federal information processing standard around that API, and Amazon will have to decide whether they want to continue that business or whether they want to fall in line. At which point, the standards question may just answer itself.
Interesting. So the government will drive it. We're coming towards the end of the panel, but I wanted to open it up and see if anybody out here had a particular question. I'm sure we'll have a few. Actually, let me hand you the microphone rather than mine repeating it.
One of the questions that seems to have come up during the discussion here is about the lack of networking, the progress of networking in the open cloud space. And one thing to note is there's a lack of participation from Cisco, Juniper, any of the companies here. This is just an observation. Mm-hmm. But my question is, the Cisco and Junipers of the world are thinking about SDNs, software-defined networks. Can somebody comment on the intersection of SDNs and the cloud space?
Who's volunteering? Jeff? Okay.
So if you look at the participation in OpenStack, the networking companies are very heavily involved, and in fact, one of the most prominent and to my mind, most innovative parts of the entire OpenStack project is Quantum, which is a framework for plugging in both software-defined and other networking capabilities and exposing it to a set of standard APIs. So it's going to be a framework to accommodate not just representing data center networks the way they are today, but actually accommodating new networking services and extending this. So in a way, this is really, really radical, and it's being driven by people like Nicira and Cisco. So I actually think this is a huge challenge for the other companies that are in this space. You know, CloudStack and Eucalyptus now have the challenge on their hands. What's their response to something like Quantum? Because that is indeed raising the bar. So I think that's where the innovation in the networking is going to come from. And I don't see any reluctance in the networking vendors to get involved in this.
So what about the SDN?
SDN. So I mean, if you're familiar with what Nicira is doing, Nicira is providing a set of extensions to Open vSwitch to allow it to be managed from their controller. It is essentially an SDN model for this. Remember, one of the things that happens with heavily virtualized environments is that the old view of the network, where there was this pristine network, and then all these parasitic little computer things stuck at the edges with Ethernet cabs, that changes. Now the networking, the routing, the switching, the access control, and so forth, goes right into the hypervisor. And so you can't separate that networking world from the virtual compute world anymore. It's deeply integrated. And software-defined networking is, if you think about it, an Open vSwitch is a software-defined network switch. And so that's why that's very deep. That's going to drive a lot of the SDN work.
Wow, this shows me how much I know about networking. I thought SDN was service delivery network.
Well, it probably isn't. You're an ex-IBMer. They had
It's a telco, man.
We're running out of time, so they're going to cut me short. I did want to say thank you to all the panelists here, because I know a lot of people had to juggle their schedules to be here. It's been a busy week, and there's a few other conferences happening. But
Thank you very much.
thank you all. Thank you